Hi everyone. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the animation basics in After Effects. Let's get started. So animation is always going to begin with a keyframe. And what I mean by that, so we're working in frames now, so 24 frames to 1 second. Every time we move the time indicator here, that's 1 frame. So if we move it 24 times, that's going to be moving it 1 second forward. So back in the old days of hand-drawn animation, we wanted it to move from here to here over 1 second, 24 frames per second. Your first frame, you would draw it here. Your 24th frame, you would draw it here. And then you would have to go and draw it on your second frame there, your third frame there, fourth frame there, etc. And you would draw in every one of those frames to fill it in. I'm just going to undo that to move back. Now with After Effects, the computer does it for you. We just have to set the keyframes. So we would set a keyframe here, and then we would set another one here, and then the computer is going to do all of the animating in between. So I'll show you how to start setting keyframes. Now in After Effects, you can set keyframes for almost every single thing in here, and you can animate almost everything. But in this tutorial, I'm just going to focus on our main transforms for this object. To see the transforms for each layer, what you want to do is click on the little arrow beside it here, expand it, and then we have transform right here, and you want to expand that one as well. So these are the different transforms we have for our layer. We have our anchor point, position, scale, rotation, and opacity. Now to make your life a whole lot easier, when you want to open up to each of these, just use a shortcut. So I'm going to close that. So each one, except for opacity, the shortcut key is just the first letter. So we can open up rotation by hitting R, the anchor point, A, scale is S, position is P, and then for the opacity, you don't use O, you use T. So you can remember transparency. So use T to open that. So I'm just going to expand that again to see all of them. Now you can adjust the rotation and scale. Like if I grab the corner here, I can adjust the scale, or I can get my rotation tool and rotate it from there. I'm just going to undo both of those. But most of them are easier to adjust right in here, except for the position. The position I usually just grab and move it with my mouse. To scale it, we can just come in here and scale it up or down. If you click this little chain here, it's going to break the constraint that it has on it. So if I just scale that one, it's only scaling it out sideways. You see it's not adjusting that one. And then I can scale it up there. And I'll just undo that and I'll set that back on. You can adjust the rotation here, and we can also adjust the opacity. So let's start by just animating the position, and we'll move it across the composition. And in order to do that, we're going to have to set our first keyframe. So to start setting keyframes, what you need to do first is click this little stopwatch right here. And when I click that, what it's going to do is set my first keyframe. And I'll just move my cursor here so you can see it. So what it did was create this little diamond shape here that we can click on. So that is a keyframe on position in this exact position. If we turn that off, it's going to delete the keyframe. So I'm going to put that back on, and now we can start setting them. So with our time indicator on the current keyframe, if we move this around anywhere, it's going to update that keyframe. So right now it's keyed right there. I'm just going to undo that and go back to our original position. So say I want to move this across our composition over about 3 seconds. So I'll scroll forward to 3 seconds. And now what I'm going to do is just grab my square and just slide it over. And you'll see we have this path following it. If you hold shift, it's going to move it perfectly straight on a line. So I just want to move it across my page to there. And so what that did was create another keyframe here. And like I had mentioned, that if we wanted to animate it in the old days where you would have to go in and draw every keyframe, now the computer is doing that for us. So when we slide it, it's adding all those in between keyframes, and each little dot on this path is a keyframe. So when we move our time slider, it's moving along that path. And if we hit play, it's going to animate across the board. And then stop right there, and that's our last keyframe, and then it doesn't keep going. Now, when I moved it across the board, it automatically set this keyframe because it knew the position changed. If I move the slider here, and then move this, it automatically sets that keyframe. But if I want to set a keyframe there without moving my square, we can do that down here. You don't want to click the stopwatch again. What that's going to do is turn off all of your keyframes. So I'm just going to undo that. You only want to hit that once when you want to start setting your keyframes. So I want to set a key there, but keep it in this same position. So to do that, you click on this little indicator here, which is to add or remove keyframes. So if I click that, it added a new one there. And now if I want to get rid of this one, I have to move my time slider over it. And then I can just hit this little icon here and it's going to remove it. Now what that did, it jumped back a bit because this is our ending spot. And now that we deleted that keyframe that was there, the computer recalculated it, and now that's where it is in the position here. So just remember that your keyframes are the main ones that you set, and then everything in between is going to be animated. So if I only want to work on the position right now, I don't need to have all of this space open here. Another shortcut that will make things easier for you is the key U. So if I press U, it's going to collapse down my square layer. I'll press U, it collapsed it down just to position because we have keyframes on there. So you can open it just to see your keyframes. If you press it twice really quick, it's going to expand more. And we can just close the ones we don't want. Okay, I'm just going to work on the position for now, so I'll hit U again and just focus on these ones. You can move the keyframes around in the time slider. So if we don't want this to start right away at the beginning, we can move it to half a second. And we know that's half a second because it says 12 frames there, and we're doing this at 24 frames per second. So here we have 1 second into our animation. At 12, we're halfway through. So I want to start at half a second in. What I'm going to do is just drag my keyframe. And you can see as I drag it, it's moving it back to the beginning because that's our first keyframe there, and we moved it to here. We can also copy and cut keys. So what I'm going to do is just move this first key all the way back to the beginning, and then I'm going to move this last key to the middle of the composition. So right now we have a 5-second composition. Halfway through, it's going to make it to the end here, and now we want it to come back to this end. So what I want to do is just copy this keyframe here and paste it here. So you can copy any keyframe by just selecting it, going up to Edit, Copy, and then with your time slider where you want to paste it, Edit, Paste, and it's going to paste it right there. So now when we scrub through it, it's going to get to the end, and then it's going to come back. We can also use our keyframes to adjust the timing of our animation. So say we want it to get to the end here, but before it comes back, we want it to stay here for a little while, maybe just a few frames, like half a second. So at about 3, we want it to start working its way back. So what we want it to do is hit this one here and then sit for a while, maybe up to here. So we just want to use this exact same keyframe and have it just stay in the same position for half a second. So what I'm going to do is just select it, do Control-C, Command on a Mac, and Control-V. So now what that did was it stops there, and then we have another keyframe there. So you'll notice it does a little jump there, and we're not going to get into this just yet. That's going to come up in another tutorial when we can adjust the type of keyframes we have. But if you notice things like this happening where you want it to sit in the same spot, because that keyframe is the same as that one, if we just click back and forth, it's not moving. But why is it moving in here? Well, it's because all of our keyframes here are a certain type of keyframe. What I'm going to do is just select them right now. And again, we're going to go into this in another tutorial, so I'm not going to explain it yet. But if you notice this happening with your keyframes right away, you can do this. So with your keyframes highlighted, right click on it, and I highlighted all of mine, and it's going to adjust all of them at the same time. And then do Keyframe Interpolation. Click on that, and now we have different options here. So I won't go into these yet, but we have linear and we have continuous Bezier. So with that one, we want to click on it and just go back to linear and hit OK. And in another tutorial, we're going to go into the different types of keyframes, so don't worry. So now when we scrub through it, it sits in that same spot. So now I'm going to hit play. It's going to animate across the composition, sit there, and then work its way back. And again, if we wanted, we can move these up and move them wherever we want. And then if we hit play, it's just going to follow that path we animated. All right, I'm going to delete all of these keyframes and I'll show you the different transform options. So to do that, you can either select all of them and hit delete. I'm going to undo that. Or you can turn off the stopwatch here, and that's going to clear out all of your frames. But I actually want this to be in the position I started with. So I'm just going to undo that for now. And what I'm going to do is go to that first keyframe, and then I'll delete them out. And then it's going to keep it in that position there. Alright, I'll just open up the different transforms now and show you some different options. So I'm not going to do the anchor point just yet, but what I'm going to do is turn my keyframes on for all 4 of these. So my position, scale, rotation, and opacity. We have 1 keyframe for each one at the beginning here. So I'm going to slide forward a bit, and I'll just start animating these. So I'm going to move my position again first. I'll hold shift to keep it nice and straight. And then I'm going to click on scale, and now I'm going to animate the scale. So if I want it to get bigger by the end, I can do that. And again, the first keyframe I set is at 100%. So over the 2.5 seconds, it's going to scale up to whatever I set this at. So let's set that to 120%, and maybe our first frame here, let's make it even smaller. So now as it moves across, it's going to scale up in size. We can also animate the rotation, so I'll click on my rotation transform. I'm going to move to the end here, and you can just slide it to rotate it. And then you see every time you move it, that's 1 time, so it's moving a full 360 once. If I keep going, 2, 3, 4, so it's done 4 full 360s, and then another 84 degrees. So now if I scroll back and hit play, it's going to be spinning as it moves over. We can also animate the opacity over time. So right now, on our first keyframe, we're at 100% opacity. I'm just going to turn that down to 0 and maybe have it fade into 100% over time. So I'll go to the end here. It's still at 0, so we don't see it. And then I'll move it up to 100. Now when we hit play, the position will move. It's going to scale up. It'll rotate across, and the opacity is going to move up. I went over this in the interface tutorial, but if we want to just preview this section, we can just move this over and then hit play, and it's just going to preview what's in this section here. And so that's a nice way to just preview what you've animated and not have to watch your entire composition. Alright, next I'll show you the anchor point. The anchor point I don't use too often, but there are a few instances where it's a nice option to have and can make your life a little easier. Okay, I'm just going to get rid of all of my old keyframes here, and again I can delete them all from my timeline, or I can just turn them all off here. Since I have my time indicator at the very beginning where I had my keyframes, when I turn off my keyframes, all those transforms from the first one will still be there. So I'm going to turn my opacity back up, and I'll just scale it back up to 100. Okay, I'm going to move this over to the middle, and I'll show you some work with the anchor point. So our anchor point is right in the middle here. When we rotate it, it's going to rotate on that anchor. So we can move that anchor a few different ways. We have this tool up here, which is the pan behind, or the anchor tool. And with that, we can grab our anchor point and move it around. Now when we rotate, it's going to rotate on that anchor. I'll undo that to get it back to the middle. We can also use these transforms right here for the anchor point. And when we move that, it's going to keep the anchor point in the middle, but it'll offset our layer from it. So you might be wondering why you would need something like this. Well, I usually don't animate the anchor point, but I use it with some other transforms. So for instance, if I want to animate my square in a circle around my composition, I could do that like this. I'll just undo my anchor point change for now. I'm going to go to my selection tool, and I'll set a position keyframe. Now what you can do is try to make a circle as best you could and animate it this way. And then we can go in and try to adjust these and smooth it out and make it more of a circle, which is really tedious and it's hard to get it looking perfect. Or we can use this simple trick with the anchor point and animating the rotation. So I'm just going to delete out all of these keyframes. And if you delete them all like I just did in the timeline, it's also going to get rid of that stopwatch just because I deleted all of them. Okay, I'm just going to move this up to the middle. And now what I want to do is just offset the anchor point a bit. And then I'm going to animate the rotation. So I'll set a keyframe on the rotation. And then I'll move this forward and then rotate it. Now, since it rotates on the anchor point, it's going to rotate from here. But since this is offset from the anchor point, it'll rotate around it in a circle. And now if I hit play, It rotates around that anchor point. Okay, one more thing I want to show you really quickly is motion blur. I'm just going to undo that to get it back to the middle, and I'm going to collapse this for now. Okay, so what I'm going to do first is just make a copy of this so you can see it with motion blur and without. And to do that, with it selected, I'll go up to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste. And then I'm just going to move it down, and I can grab it and move it like that, or like with the other programs, I can also inch it down using my arrow keys, and if I hold Shift, it'll move further. Okay, I'll move this down a little ways, and what I'm going to do is just animate them across the page here, and you can do that quickly for both of them by just selecting both of them. I'll hit P to open up the position on both those layers, and I'll hit the stopwatch. So what that did was set a first keyframe for both of those. All right, I'm just going to go about a second into my timeline, and I'll move them to the end here. We're just going to preview that part. So right now, both of them are moving without any motion blur. I'm going to put motion blur on one of them, and what that's going to do is as it moves, it's going to blur it depending on how fast and how far it's moving. So to turn on motion blur, you're going to want to come down to this little icon here in our timeline. These little circles. Enables motion blur for all layers with the motion blur switch set. So what I want to do is turn that on. Now when I hit play, they still don't have motion blur because even though I turned it on, now I have to activate it for each layer that I want it on. So let's turn it on for this layer here. You'll see this little icon here, which is the same as the one up here. If I click in there, now that is just going to turn motion blur on for that one layer. Now when I hit play, I don't know how well you can see the difference, but if I pause it in the middle, you'll see that as it's moving, the edge kind of blurs out there. And if it moves faster, it blurs even more. So let's blur it over half a second. And now if we go to the middle, it's even more blurred, and that doesn't have any blur on it. So if I hit play on this, you should be able to see the difference. So without motion blur on, as it moves, you almost get kind of this strobing effect because it's just going from that frame to that frame to that frame. And so it almost blinks as it goes. So what this does is it kind of blurs them together so we get one more smooth motion across instead of that kind of flickering that we get. So this is nice to turn on for any of your layers that are moving because it's going to kind of cut down on that strobing and give it a nice blur. We'll go into much more detail with animation as we go on with the tutorials, but I just wanted to give you a good starting point for understanding how animation works in After Effects. Alright, that's going to do it for this tutorial.